Well, our first panel took a look at the intersection of land and water, beaches, shoreline, coastal wetlands, and the importance and difficulty of keeping them clean and safe along the Great Lakes. There are many factors that keep on changing. Beaches are one of our greatest assets in the Great Lakes. They are a vital part of our tourism industry, offering the quintessential summer getaway for both residents and tourists alike.
So in the summertime, in July, I can't think of a better place to be than at one of our Great Lakes beaches. You can just go for a walk and you can see for miles. You know, some of the vantage points in the Great Lakes are you can climb up these sand dunes and see for miles. So it's really exciting to be able to be in those places and smell the fresh air and hear the waves going across the sand and just letting your mind relax.
Making sure our beaches are clean and healthy is becoming a big priority. Extensive monitoring is done to ensure a safe beach experience for the majority of the swimming season.
Beach monitoring is done by the 8 Great Lakes states. US EPA collects every year the results, and over the last 7 years they've been reporting that 95% of the days where swimming is available, that people can swim.
Typically when we have beach closures around Michigan and the other Great Lakes states, it's because of bacterial levels, usually E. coli and enterococci. Bacteria is always in the water. It comes from animal waste, any kind of animals, birds, dogs, humans. And when you have a beach closure, usually it's following a storm event where you may have crossed sewage lines with stormwater drain-off lines that result in extra bacteria in the water bodies in the swimming beaches. But it can come from, even if it's close to marinas, it can come from discharges out of boats, which you're not supposed to do, but people do. It can come from leaky septic systems, agricultural fields, so it can come from a number of sources where you can get waste into the water system.
Monitoring water quality at our beaches is evolving into a more predictive model. This forecasting of water quality conditions will supplement the old persistence model, which takes time to get results and thus make decisions.
We call it the persistence model because we can't get those results back for 18 to 24 hours. And so it's operating the assumption that the water quality from one day is persisting to the next.
And this has been a frustrating situation because they're always getting their data about a day late. You know, the results are coming in a day late. And that's why we're very excited about these new predictive models, because they are helping us take the E. coli results and putting them in context with what's happening at the beach. Did it just rain? What are the waves like? Is the wind direction coming out of the north or the south? A lot of those things we're finding make a difference.
Increasing our monitoring capability is one part of the puzzle. Recent funding is allowing the region to address contamination sources and restore ecosystems that keep our waters clean.
So the beach sanitary surveys have helped us identify sources of contamination, and that's led us to actually remediate and fix about 72 beaches over the past 3 years using the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funds. So we're very excited that these beaches that have had problems in the past are either being redesigned, the stormwater runoff is being redirected through a coastal wetland or through special chambers, and we're minimizing the impact that stormwater has on our beaches.
You know, we've lost a lot of wetlands around the Great Lakes, and restoring some of those wetlands to be a natural filter for the bacterial and contaminants into our water supply in general is one of the, I think, best ways that you could do this. A lot of forecasters are looking at alternative methods, but the best way is probably really just restoring the natural kidneys of the system, the wetlands.
And we continue here on Great Lakes Now Connect with our second panel. They are tackling water levels and the impact that those changing levels can have. Our moderator is Dr. Patrick Doran, Director of Conservation Programs at the Nature Conservancy.
Yeah. Thank you, Christy. And thanks to that first panel, I had a great discussion with Katie and the panelists where they covered quite a variety of issues. But now we're going to focus in a little more specifically on lake levels, the impacts of lake levels across various sectors in the Great Lakes, and perhaps some solutions in how to deal with a great deal of lake level change. But first, I'd like to introduce my panelists. On this side of me, we have John Allen. He works with the state of Michigan, where he's the director of the Office of the Great Lakes. Dr. Drew Grunwald works with NOAA, where he's a hydrologist in the Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab. And over on my far left is Jen Reed. Dr. Jen Reed is the Deputy Director, University of Michigan Water Center, and Executive Director of the Great Lakes Observing Center, and Glenn Neckvisill, the Vice President of the Lake Carriers Association in Ohio. So thanks for panelists today. I really love that first video when the writer talked about the little slice of the UP, and that we all have that little slice, to me, a little slice of the Great Lakes. So if you want to start, John, what's your little slice of the Great Lakes, but also not just you personally, but in your work, what's that slice of the Great Lakes?
Sure, I was thinking about that question when I saw the video, and in some ways it's like choosing amongst all your children. You love all the little corners of Michigan and the Great Lakes and the U.S. side and the Canadian side to our Canadian friends, but where I go, where my mind goes, actually, whether my body's there or not, where my mind goes, I go to Beaver Island. That's one of the little corners of Michigan and one of the corners of the Great Lakes that I love. I love islands. I'm an island guy, and I think islands sort of encapsulate all the kinds of things we talk about: their community, their home, their family, their working communities. They're also resort communities or summer communities. I think they capture all of those moments for us. As far as the Office of the Great Lakes, where our special corners are, they are all over. I mean, it's really about our relationship to the Great Lakes, our relationship to the shoreline, I think are all really critical for the state and for the region.
Thanks. And Drew, I know you didn't grow up in the Great Lakes region, but where did it start to intersect your life?
Right, that's a good question. So I have a couple of spotty memories here and there from interacting with the Great Lakes, but the one that stands out for this discussion, for my work at NOAA right now, has to do with sort of taking flights over the Great Lakes and the perspective that gives you on their sheer magnitude. One particular flight is the one from Chicago up to Houghton, and you get to see sort of the whole transect of Lake Michigan. And I remember thinking that on that flight, looking around the plane going, is anybody else blown away by this? And one other part of that is that there are a lot of other water bodies in the country that people notice a lot more readily. For example, Lake Mead or Lake Tahoe or Lake Okeechobee that are easily identifiable, and one of the things we're trying to work on is to make the Great Lakes a little more recognizable in a national context.
Great. Jen, what do you think? What's one of your first memories?
Wow, that's a really tough question. I do have this awesome memory, though, so I grew up in Ontario, northeast of Toronto, away from the Great Lakes. So I didn't have a view of the Great Lakes sort of as a daily experience. But I remember going to Toronto one time and coming down Highway 115. And there's this point where you come around 115 and Lake Ontario opens up in front of you. And I just remember, I mean, too young to understand the concept of sublime, but it was. It was just so large, and it blew me away. And thus, the Great Lakes have sort of drawn me back ever since to study and luckily to work with them. So some of the things we do at the Water Center, University of Michigan Water Center, is looking to restoration and helping to think about, are we doing restoration right, and what kinds of assessment and analysis can we do to improve restoration? And then at the Great Lakes Observing System, making sure we have the data and information we need to really know if we're advancing. What are the baselines that we're measuring against? And then can we see improvements over time?
Yeah, we heard a lot of importance stressed on availability of data to make some really key informed decisions. And so Glenn, you come from the southern side of Lake Erie. What's some of your memories?
Well, it's true that I come from Cleveland, Ohio, but actually in the fall we like to hop in the car and drive up to Marquette, spend the night at the Landmark Inn, and then head over to Duluth, to Fitkers, and maybe run the shore over to Thunder Bay. So we love the Great Lakes, especially in the fall. Professionally, obviously, I wouldn't have an industry if there weren't the Great Lakes. Ships float, and as a matter of fact, that's why they're the greenest form of transportation. There's the least amount of friction as you move a ship through water, so we can move cargo and use less fuel per ton and fewer emissions.
Yeah, as we mentioned earlier, I grew up in a small port town in Conneaut, Ohio, where some of my first memories are going down to the bluffs and watching those ships come in every single day, and always seeing the biggamen ships, as I called them when I was a little kid. I don't know why I use that word. So our Great Lakes coastal systems, John, tell us some of these. I mean, we heard these favorite places around the Great Lakes, from the north to the south, from the east to the west. We've got quite a resource in our coastal systems here. Tell us just a little bit about the Great Lakes coast. It's more than just the beaches we heard about earlier on.
It is. It's really a spectacular suite of resources with different types of ecosystems and different types of human systems as we move from industrial systems to suburban and rural systems on the lakes. We still have some farming that are sort of near the lakes, probably less and less so than we used to in so many ways. our port communities, our harbor communities, really drive so much of their relationship with the lakes. They are our keyholes out onto the Great Lakes, whether you have a large boat, a small boat, a canoe, a kayak. These are ways that we get on. Beaches obviously are really critical and important points of entry as we relate and interrelate. There's something about life at the edge, right? There's something about the sound of water. There's something about being able to look out and see that expanse of the world that is infinite. We've had some friends come and visit us, and from the east and the west coast, and they look out and say, you can't see the other side. No, you can't. These are vast, defining resources for us. But how we live our life at the coastal zone is so critical. How we live our life and how nature exists within the fluctuations that are provided. And we're going to talk a lot about water levels over the next hour, but water levels come and go. They come up, they go down. Those are also part and parcel to healthy systems, and how humans interact at those margins also help define the health of our system. So we have beautiful diversity, but we also have beautiful human diversity at the water's edge too.
So Drew, in your work with NOAA, where you're a scientist, and I know that you're getting out a lot, talking to a lot of user groups, and John says the we. Who are the people that are coming to you? Because there's a lot of different sectors that are looking for that data, for that information, for those predictions. What are those sectors that are coming to you and your group for that type of information?
Yeah, right. The user group covers the whole gamut. A few highlights include the hydropower industry. They want to understand the water level dynamics and how they can make better projections of power. The shipping industry, as we'll find out more about later. But even individual homeowners. We get phone calls from individuals, many of whom own cottages or shoreline property. A good example are the homeowners in Georgian Bay who call and have questions about long-term water level changes and short-term water level changes. And we take a lot of pride in being able to answer some of those questions. And fortunately, we have a lot of very good data that we can use to help answer those questions.
So Jen, he mentioned some homeowners in different places around the Great Lakes, from Georgian Bay, where we have a very rocky coast, to some of our more highly erodible coasts, some of our beach. What are some of the various lake level issues in those communities?
Great question, Patrick. And I think it depends whether the water is going up or coming down and nodding at the long-term average as it's on its way by. But you mentioned some highly erodible areas. Obviously, under systems or situations where we have higher water levels, we run into problems of erosion. We've seen in the late 1980s, when the water levels were very high, that we had homes falling into Lake Michigan and other areas where there's those kinds of dangers. What we're just experiencing now for the last maybe 10 years or so would be long-term lows. And in situations like Georgian Bay, where it's more rocky and it's harder to dredge or otherwise improve your access to your cottage or your home, you have problems of access to the waterfront. And so those are the kinds of situations people run into.
So in preparation for this discussion today, I always do this before I talk. I go to Google, and I go to Google News, and I type in Great Lakes water levels, and I got 6,000 different news stories. I mean, it's really 6,000 different news stories in the recent past year or two, which amazes me. And I read from all different perspectives. And I know I'm reading it, and I know there's some myths. I know a lot of things get some news that might not really be the big issues. So I want to kind of hit first, let's just try to dispel some of these myths. And these are really the questions I also get, the very first questions you get from somebody. Tell me about all the water that's leaving through the Chicago area waterway. So is that a drop in the bucket, Drew, or is that something we really should be paying attention to?
Yeah, it really is. The major drivers of the water level change in the Great Lakes system are the interplay between precipitation over this massive area and evaporation off the lake surfaces themselves.
So when somebody says, the St. Clair River is the reason why lake levels are low.
Right. The main drivers of the water levels are the precipitation and evaporation over the long term. Other factors such as the flow between the lakes certainly have a factor, certainly have an impact. The Chicago diversion is really a very small amount of water relative to these other factors, as are some of the other diversions of water that come into and out of the Great Lakes Basin.
Right. And so, John, I know you deal a lot with water withdrawals and with the state in your past work with the Great Lakes Compact and water withdrawal tools. Some people are also worried about, all the various withdrawals for all different purposes and leaving the basin or coming to the basin. Again, is that something that is really the main things we should pay attention to, or are those kind of peripheral things?
Well, I think how we withdraw water and how we use water and how we put water back does matter. Sure. I think in the great hydrologic cycle of the Great Lakes, as Drew mentioned, the diversions that we've seen, the diversions in, whether it's in Superior, the diversions out, are still small parts of an overall hydrologic cycle, and those are still fairly large numbers. How we use water within the system matters. It matters a lot. How we withdraw water from small systems, small tributaries, matters a lot at that scale. But in terms of the overall scale of the Great Lakes, we're talking about fairly small amounts of water. Remember that the same amount of water is on the earth as there's always been. We haven't made more or lost more water, so it's really about where it is at any one period of time. So as we talk about storms coming in and going out, it's really driven by storm systems, snow systems, evaporation systems, ice cover, these large controlling factors. But I don't want to underplay how we use water within the system matters.
Great. So what we can do now is we're going to cut away to a video that's going to kind of talk about lake levels, and then we're going to dive back into some of these mechanisms and how they really drive and impact the various sectors that we represent. So, Christy, to the video.
The Great Lakes are a dynamic and powerful freshwater system. Coastal communities and ecosystems are always adapting the ever-changing conditions on our coasts. This January, Lakes Michigan and Huron saw their lowest water levels ever recorded, the impacts of which are seen not only at our beaches, but throughout nearly every sector of our economy.
Low lake levels are presenting incredible challenges for lots of different user groups. When you look at navigation, the big ships that carry commodities through the Great Lakes, whether it's iron ore or grain, they have to light load, and that costs them money and that costs jobs.
For every inch of water depth that we lose, one of our 1,000-foot ships gives up 270 tons of cargo for each inch each trip. It's a tremendous inefficiency that's built into our system. It trickles throughout the supply chain, and at the end of the day will result in more expensive steel, more expensive power, more expensive roads, and more expensive homes.
Recreational boating is another industry feeling the effects of low water levels. With federal dredging dollars stretched thin, some Great Lakes harbors are left to fend for themselves. The Detroit Yacht Club is one group that is funding their own dredging project so their members can safely navigate the harbor this boating season.
We've been here on the banks of the Detroit River for 145 years, and for us the water is our way of life, and without that we're sunk. So we know that we got to make the investment and literally dig ourselves out of this one. We've got only a couple feet of water here right now, and we're hoping to get down to about 6 feet of water. And without that, boats are hitting the bottom, propellers are hitting the bottom, churning up mud with every excursion leaving the dock. And if we let it go too much longer, if we don't get some water back, we wouldn't be able to float them at all.
The low water levels we're seeing now are just part of a bigger picture in the basin. We need to understand how to deal with the range of conditions we'll see in the long term.
The challenge today, in 2013, is low levels. We've had, a record low in January that was the lowest that we've ever recorded on Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. But in 1986, we had the highest level ever recorded. So these, the challenges they come and they go. And what we need to do though is to do the kind of monitoring and modeling on a regular basis to kind of get a better understanding of why the lakes go up and down the way they do, and then to help planners and managers to do a better job of adapting to the lakes than they do now.
One of the clear needs within the Great Lakes community that we've sensed is a need to be able to view and understand this data, the water level data, and the drivers behind water levels over these various timescales. NOAA and other organizations are continuously doing research on how to better understand what's happening with regard to the water budget and water levels, and how we can use that understanding to improve our projections.
Changing lake levels can cause headaches for humans living near the coast, but from a biological standpoint, fluctuating lake levels are integral to coastal ecosystem health.
That up and down, that natural up and down is what is good for the environment. In the past, by regulating water levels, say on Lake Ontario, regulation has destroyed wetlands. Many of the wetlands on Lake Ontario are gone. And so our commission is working on trying to restore a more natural up and down of the system in Lake Ontario so we can restore those wetlands. The lakes are very dynamic, and we need to learn to live with what Mother Nature gives us rather than trying to change it.
The more lake level related challenges our infrastructure, ecosystems, and economy faces, the more complex the issue becomes. The best asset we have in dealing with water levels is increasing knowledge and foresight and helping the basin's decision makers adapt to our best understanding.
The changes that we are seeing right now are real and present. It's the how can we help folks access new information so that they can adapt to the changes that aren't currently being realized, but that may be exacerbated down the road.
Thank you. That's a great video. And it talked a lot about both behavior of people, our infrastructure, our predictability, and the impacts of Great Lakes levels. But I think before we can begin to talk about some solutions and impacts to our particular sector of society, we have to understand lake levels and why lake levels change and how they have changed over the long term and how they're predicted to change into the future. So Drew, can you kind of first just characterize the past for us? I know you are the master of data, and I've seen your computer models and your Great Lakes dashboard. So tell us a little bit about what does the past look like in terms of lake levels throughout the Great Lakes?
Sure. Well, part of the answer to that question starts off with the fact that we're very fortunate to have a long period of record, a long data set where we have water level measurements that go back into the mid-1800s. So that forms the basis for our understanding of this long-term trends. And what we've seen over time are, as we've indicated before, periods of highs and periods of low water levels. Most notably in the mid-1960s, around 1964 was the last period of lows on most of the systems, followed by a period of highs in the mid-1980s. And we find that these water levels relate very closely with major changes in precipitation patterns over the basin.
Okay, so this gets at some of the mechanisms that really drive. So what are some of those important variables or factors and mechanisms that cause these changes in water levels?
Sure. So the big three that we tend to talk about are precipitation over the lakes themselves, keeping in mind that these lakes are huge. About a third of the entire basin area is surface water. And there's no other system like that on the planet in terms of fresh water where there's that much water area. So over lake evaporation, over lake precipitation, and then finally the third is runoff. Those three together, we call them collectively the net basin supply of water. And that volume of water that comes in really dictates the rate at which water levels rise and the rate at which they fall, along with other factors such as how much water is flowing in from an upstream lake and how much water flows to a downstream lake. Those things together in concert dictate the water levels.
And so, but we also see some long-term variability, and we see some seasonal or short-term variability as well, correct?
Absolutely, yep. So within the course of an individual year, typically a cycle will start out where we'll have snowmelt and precipitation in the early spring. Water levels typically rise during that time of year. Water levels typically will peak during the summertime. And then throughout the fall, when we see a lot of the evaporation, the combination of cool air coming in over the lakes coupled with warm water is really what drives evaporation. And then water levels will drop typically into the wintertime and then repeat that cycle. That's sort of the typical cycle, and those are the drivers of that cycle.
And so we've seen a lot of rains this spring, and I've seen some data show that Lake Michigan went up, John, a few inches on Lake Michigan, 6 inches.
Substantially more than that, yeah.
So is that a normal type of spring event, or is that something just different about this particular spring?
Well, just keep in mind that normal is an average over a long period of time. So any one year may not be normal. In fact, there may not be a lot of normals. Normal is an average. What we experience is what reality is, not necessarily what an average is. So last year we saw a early, warm, dry spring, and lake levels came up maybe 4 inches. I think I've seen the data. This year, if you remember, we've had a cooler, wetter spring with a substantial amount of water coming into the system. And the lake levels have risen as quickly as I can remember on the graphs. I'm not sure if it's historically quickly, but it sure feels like it. I'm sure if you've been in communities with flooding, you probably felt that water levels came up quite quickly. So I'd say over last year and this year, it was probably on average, but we didn't experience average. We experienced a warm, dry year, and we experienced a cool, wet year. But that is really what we have to learn to live with within the Great Lakes. That is what nature provides us as variability.
So Glenn, in the shipping and navigation industry, how do they pay attention to lake levels? What do you look for? What are the data, or where do you plug into monitoring lake levels?
Well, we get our water level information from the Corps and from NOAA, and it's critically important for our industry. Depending on the size of your ship, you carry anywhere from 50 to 270 tons of cargo for each inch that you're submerged in the water. So the problem is here now with these low water levels, we're losing in some instances 2.5 feet of draft. So that means ships that used to come down to St. Clair with 70,000 tons of coal for the power plant, they're now coming in with about 60,000 tons. And that's the same thing for the ships that are taking iron ore to the steel mills in Detroit, the ships that are loading limestone in Rogers City, calcite, Cedarville, they're leaving cargo behind because of these lower water levels.
And so can the industry be adaptable when they see a short level change like the springtime? I mean, are you paying attention week to week or month to month?
You pay attention to water. You pay attention to almost on an hourly basis. I mean, obviously, the last thing you want to have happen is have your boat hit bottom. Right. So water levels are critically important to us.
So Jen, can you comment on the value? It seems like data like we're collecting with NOAA or with the Army Corps are incredibly valuable in some of the observing systems. So how much value do we place in those types of data? Do people see it? Do they not see it? Do they understand how valuable they are? Do they not?
That's a great question. I think, unfortunately, in general, people don't recognize the value of the data. I think the end users certainly do, and the ones who rely on it to make critical decisions really understand how valuable it is to have the systems out there to collect the data, to integrate the data, and report the data. The challenge is translating that for the rest of us who are paying taxes to support these systems to understand then why it's important to maintain these systems over time. Right. Not just in times of low water to make sure ships aren't hitting bottom, but just to have a long-term average or long-term understanding. These long-term data sets are key for planning, for projecting what might happen in the future, really for all the important decisions we'll be making.
So let's talk a little bit about the future. I know in the past panel, Katie mentioned climate change and some of the trends we've seen in precipitation, one of the major inputs, as well as some of the future projections of those. And I know you were part of the International Joint Commission, where together we served on an adaptive management team, which took into account climate change impacts on lake levels. So can you tell me just a little bit about some of the potential, some of the future for lake level changes?
Well, I think that's the real takeaway I brought from it was there's still a lot of uncertainty about what that future looks like. Are levels going to be down consistently over the time? Are they going to be up? And I think we've seen multiple scenarios where they're up and down. And I think the takeaway then in thinking about living along the shore and living with the lakes, as the point was made in the last video segment, is to adapt to the potential of levels going up and coming down. Mm-hmm. Understanding where you are in a certain location if you're vulnerable to highs or lows, and planning for those highs and lows, and making sure that your community, your business, even your property, that you've done everything you can to adapt to those potentials.
So John, I know you're a big fan of thinking about risk and scenarios and future. So how do you think about risk? How do you think about that in the decisions that you either advise in your position or decisions that a homeowner makes?
I think it plays out in decisions that both individuals make, and I think it plays out in the way decisions that communities make and companies make. So if a company is designing a water intake structure, they have to think about that water intake structure relative to a range of water levels. Then looking at the map and saying, here's a mean water level, let's always assume that it's going to be at that mean water level. So that matters in how you ultimately look at things like infrastructure or dock walls or even docks that can be raised and lowered as opposed to a dock that's now fixed and in 10 years water levels are higher or lower and we're looking at that dock saying, gee, I wish I'd built a different dock. But we can engineer systems at the water's edge to understand that those waters come and go. understanding what bulkheads look like and what water pressure on bulkheads look like with that water coming and going matters. When you build a wall and you have water against it, that water pushes against that wall. When water drops, that wall tends to want to fall in because there's no more water pressure on that. Understanding the nature of dynamics and hydrologics on infrastructure matters. So all those things are individual decisions we can make, whether it's at the business level, the community level, planning playgrounds and beaches, or at the homeowner level in terms of what does my relationship to that lake look like. So those are all important things that we can decide on as individuals.
So let's take one quick step back here and think about those various sectors of society that we talked about. And what are the impacts of lake level changes, or the impacts of high levels or low levels, or variability, or sustained high levels or sustained low levels? And I'm going to quiz you around to hit on a few of them. So Jen, what about kind of the recreational or tourism industry? Again, it's one thing where I have seen lots of newspaper articles talking about low level impacts on recreation, tourism, marinas.
Absolutely. Anybody who's tried to drop a boat in the last couple of years knows that many of our boat launches are high and dry, whether those are state launches or at private marinas or in municipal marinas. And so that's been an impact for sure. But you know, those same boat launches when water is high are equally unusable because those are fixed infrastructure and they can't really adapt to levels going up and down. So we've seen, you know, communities, several communities around the state where their access to the big lake as it is much more shallow than usual, so they can't get the big ships in. They can't get by big, not necessarily big commercial vessels, but fixed keel sailboats or the larger, you know, 40-foot recreational vessels. That has a huge economic impact on those communities that rely on that traffic to come into their communities, spend the money, buy the gas. It's kind of like the beach closing story. If you can't get those people in to recreate in your community, to go fishing and all the things that they would normally want to do with their vessels, they're not spending their money there. They're going to the next community where they can. So
Glenn, you talked about some of the impacts of low levels and having to lighten the load a little bit. What about when we have sustained high levels? Do you see some kind of impacts to access and impacts as well?
Yeah, actually high water levels are not quite the boon you would think they are to ship operators. First of all, you can reach a point where your ship is going to be too high in the water and can't get under the loading rig. And then also, too, when water is very high in the connecting channels, you have to slow down so that you're not creating wake. But the current situation that we're in, where we have the low water levels, is having a tremendous impact. As I said, we're losing 10,000 tons of cargo. That has obviously an impact on the ship operator, but remember, it takes 1.5 tons of iron ore to make a ton of steel. It takes 85,000 tons of aggregate to build a road, a mile of highway. So the fact that we can't deliver as much cargo as we should is having impacts throughout the whole economy. And we have here on the lakes basically a fixed navigation season. Right. We have 10 months to deliver our customers' annual needs. And you can't make the ships go any faster. They're already running at their maximum speed. It's not like you can take your car and, okay, we're going to go 70 miles an hour for a while. You can't do that with a ship. So we have 10 months to get our job done. That's why we have to get this dredging backlog cleared up. We've got 18 million cubic yards of sediment clogging our harbors, and that's got to be resolved.
So John, tell us a little bit about ecology and the ecosystems and the natural systems. How do they respond to or perhaps need lake level changes and fluctuations?
Well, Drew mentioned humans have been monitoring the Great Lakes. It's probably some of the oldest monitored freshwater systems in the world. I'm guessing that's pretty close. So clearly that variability has been with us a long time, and it's mattered. But we've also seen that we know that variability was even greater earlier, over many, 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 many centuries. So the lakes have adapted, water at the margin has adapted to be a healthy system in a fluctuating system. Wetlands come and go as water levels rise and lower. So it relies on sort of those natural processes at the water's edge. As water ebbs out, right, as it leaves our system, as it falls into these lower periods, we see a lot of emergence of aquatic vegetation, for instance. And as water levels come back, those become nursery grounds for fisheries. So that's a part of a healthy dynamic. We also recognize that as that vegetation grows now with invasive species, now with Phragmites, that starts to cause problems for other individuals as those dominate the shoreline in these cases. But the variability of the lakes in and of themselves is a part of the healthy function. Now, variability within a certain band, is it going to stay low? Is it going to stay lower than average? Is that trend a long-term trend that we need to attend to with things like climate change and these other sort of climatological factors? That starts to make us look at the system a little bit differently.
Sure.
But these are healthy functioning systems at the margin's edge with water variability.
So Drew, you did talk a little bit about the hydropower industry and I imagine municipal water users too. Where do they run into trouble both at the highs and the lows of lake levels?
That's a good question. I would say that when water levels are not, well, one of the factors is that when we cannot predict what's going to happen, and when I say we, there's a strong partnership in the Great Lakes region that puts together forecasts of water levels and flows. It's a very big challenge for the hydropower industry if they can't predict the amount of flow coming through and plan accordingly for the distribution of power. That's one of the biggest challenges that they would face.
Right. All right, so we've talked about some of these impacts to various parts of the Great Lakes and Great Lakes industry and our Great Lakes way of life. Let's spend this last 10 minutes or so on solutions. What are we going to do? What can we do? Both infrastructure, our management decisions, and I imagine we'll probably get to a little bit of behavioral shifts and behavioral decisions. So what about near term? Glenn, you mentioned an immediate need for dredging. So can you characterize where and what and who and how?
Well, dredging is needed throughout the entire Great Lakes system. As I said, we have 18 million cubic yards. Right now, what is usually setting the draft, though, is a stretch of the St. Mary's River that is right below the Soo Locks. And the thing that's so irritating to industry, we have in this country what's called a Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, and it is funded by a tax that is assessed on cargo.
This is a national
tax. It takes in about $1.6 billion a year, but the government only spends about $800 million. They're using the rest of it to what we call paper balance the budget. They're trying to mask the size of the federal deficit. So this fund has a surplus of $7 billion. It's going to grow to $9 billion. And meanwhile, as I said, we're losing 10,000 tons of cargo. The port of St. Joe is closed. Holland, Michigan has been closed a couple times. We lost the coal trade to Dunkirk, New York, because we can't get ships in that harbor. So we have legislation right now that would require the government to spend what the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund brings in each year. And that would, in a relatively short period of time, get the Great Lakes and actually the whole nation's waterway systems dredged to project dimensions again.
How many harbors are we talking about around the Great Lakes?
Yeah, on the U.S. side of the lakes, we have 60 harbors that are federally maintained and then some others that are privately maintained.
So that funding goes to the federally maintained?
Federally maintained, yes.
So Jen, what about the dredging issue for the other side, or John even, what about the dredging issue for the marina, the public access?
The public access. Well, there's a whole other part of this system that we're referring to, which is sort of the small harbors, the shallow harbors. Many of those are also federally authorized, but also some state authorized and locally maintained harbors as well. And those have an even larger, I would say, dredging backlog and a pretty important need there too. Now I know the state has just announced in Michigan at least some emergency dredging for those particular harbors. I think John would be well placed to speak to that because it's a very important step.
Yeah, so John, can you just tell us a little of the mechanisms? Are there sticking points in this funding? Is there backlog? Is there some need?
Well, there was great backlog, and as water levels hit their historic lows, that highlighted the need for dredging our recreational communities, our recreational harbors, our ports. And I think the governor, his staff, and the legislature recognized early on as we started to get into this cycle that dredging was going to become an important part to make sure Michigan was open for business. So the legislature and the governor's office, working all together, were able to come up with about $21 million in Michigan to put on the table to make sure our communities were able to contract for the kinds of dredging they needed, so we do have that recreational season.
Now, are those dollars similar to the federal dollars? Where they're
These were state dollars, so general fund dollars were allocated by the legislature, and then the Waterways Commission, I think they did a beautiful job working the Waterways Commission in reallocating some dollars that they had available to them that had initially been going to some infrastructure projects. They said, yes, we need infrastructure, but what we really need is to make sure that we have a boating season in Michigan and that people can get on the water. So they were able to redirect those, and they came up with a package of about $21 million to be able to see the kinds of activity that we needed to make sure that we have that recreation season. I say that we don't want to get ourselves in that position every year, so what we really want to do is start to look long-term at what sediment management systems need to look like. So it's not just always digging our way out. Yes, we were at that point, low water level, sediment, lack of federal funding in this case, certainly on the commercial side, but we want to make sure that we understand where the sediment's coming from, how it's getting there, keeping it out of the system before it gets in is a lot better than trying to dig it out at the end of the system.
So we'll get into some of those long-term, but are there any other short-term solutions that people are dealing with or proposing right now, kind of immediate impacts? Anything the landowner or homeowner can do immediately, or any actions you see out there that might even be maladaptive a couple years down the road? I mean, the dredging issue is the one that's on the top of everybody's mind.
That's the one that's really been driving the system in terms of getting boats on the water. Right. I think ultimately as we look at behavior, we can talk about that in a little bit. Sure. These are a little longer term strategies for making sure that we understand that. I mean, part of it is making sure that people do know that we're open for business, that there are places. I mean, obviously call ahead. Yeah. There may be a community or two that has shallower water than before. So part of it's, we talked about with beaches, call ahead, make sure you understand your water system, where you're going to go, make sure your marina's open. Mm-hmm. If you're boating to another state, understand that. Right. And so I think there's some short-term that people can do just in terms of the way they think about their vacation season or planning ahead.
So let's think about longer term, and you mentioned some interesting things with the intersection, not just of lake level change, but also perhaps some contaminants in those sediments we have to think about, or the sources of those sediments where we can't just be working on the Band-Aid solution down here, we have to get to the source of the problem. Does the industry think about the sediment, the input as well?
As a matter of fact, that's something that came up at a conference that we were at last week. I'm told at least that most of what's dredged out of the Maumee River in Toledo, Ohio, is Indiana farmland. Mm-hmm. The problem is the Corps of Engineers said their authority stops at the waterline. So I don't know how we're going to get the people in Indiana, and I'm not picking on Indiana here, folks, but I don't know. It is certainly something we need to do, because you're absolutely right. Why should we keep dredging the Maumee River and the Cuyahoga River every year if we could just stop this influx? There was a study in Ohio, I think 54% of what we dredge out of the Cuyahoga River is farmland that has washed down from above.
And we mentioned in the first panel, they don't want to be losing that farmland. They want to keep that to farm because...
I wish Indiana would stay in Indiana. I mean, believe me.
So what do you see, Jen, in terms of some of these? Another big thing is the infrastructure that we have. And I'm always fascinated. We can go to our salty coasts, and people are used to daily changes in lake levels. And they have as many marinas, and they have as many boats, and they have as many ports. But it seems to me that we often start to get a little surprised when lake levels change. So what can we do long-term about some of our infrastructure from, well, we'll talk to Glenn here about some of the major infrastructure, but also some of the marinas, some of the boat accesses. How do we begin to rethink our design and our development of the infrastructure?
Well, that's definitely something we thought about as part of the Upper Great Lakes study, and really thinking about in the adaptive management regime, sort of how do you plan so that you can handle high water levels and low water levels. And I think we've mentioned a few of them here already, but putting an infrastructure that docks, for example, that can float, so that you don't have to worry that all of a sudden you've got 4 feet between you and the boat you're trying to get onto. Similarly, making sure that your water intake is far enough out into the lake or the river, wherever you're getting your water from, that it's not going to be affected. It's below a certain level that it needs to be to get good, clean water. It's not going to get affected by, if you're in Lake Erie, for example, water that doesn't have oxygen in it. And, there are a number of ways to think about it, but that takes understanding sort of what does the system look like, and understanding sort of a longer term data set. And then also understanding what are the warnings looking ahead. So what are those performance indicators for whatever your adaptive strategy is, making sure that your strategy is working. And so monitoring the data to understand and changing your adaptations, tweaking them a little bit as you move along. That's the sort of management side of adaptive management.
Glenn, do you see the shipping industry looking 15, 20, 50, 100 years out in the future and thinking about their infrastructure decisions or their ship design or anything else?
Well, you know, the physics of shipping haven't changed much.
No.
A ship floats because it displaces more water than it weighs. So we don't have any innovative designs out there that can increase our carrying capacity. But I guess at the risk of sounding like a broken record, the answer for us is dredging. Because, for example, if you go out and order a new boat today, okay, a 1,000-foot long ship, probably going to be $150 million, and it'll take 2 years to get here. And frankly, I don't know how you're going to get a bank to finance it when you're going to tell the bank, I'm only can use 80% of the ship's capacity right now. So again, for us, the issue is we've got to get the system restored to project dimensions.
So John, let's hit on behavior a little bit and expectations, because I think a lot of it gets to be our own personal behavior. Sometimes we go up north and are just uncomfortable looking at a lot of bottomland that's now exposed. We got to get over that, don't we?
Well, I don't know if getting over it's the right word, but I think understanding in shallow systems, for instance, if you live in a shallow embayment, water levels just don't rise and lower. It looks, I mean, they do go up, but the way you experience that is with more and less beach. Mm-hmm. So you look out there and you see this great expanse of beach, and it is alarming. We understand that people see parts of the bottomlands of our Great Lakes that haven't been exposed in their lifetime. But we also have to understand, if you look over the 100, 150 years of records that Drew's talked about, that NOAA's done some beautiful work in putting those on the web, people can see that. We're still really within the bandwidth that we've been in for about 100 years. We've been low. We've been lower than average for this period of time. It has great effect on both our harbors and our shipping industry, and we have to make sure that we're accommodating and understanding that. Right. But as we look at that water, we're also really looking at natural systems and the way that they fluctuate. What we're trying to do is understand how humans interact with that, and that does start to take a little bit of a mindset. Mm-hmm. Do I bring the lake levels, to some fixed point forever and say this is average and thus they have to always be this way? Or do I say we'd have to understand what this long-term trajectory looks like and how do we design into that?
Well, that kind of hits on all the things from infrastructure to behavior, but let's go and grab some questions from the video. First, we'll go to a video question that we have.
My name's Ray Edwards. I do have a question about the Great Lakes with these water levels so low. When do the biologists think this water level is going to come up? Because it's probably down 2 feet and it's been like that for 2 years.
All right, so Drew, is going to be one for you as the hydrologist on the panel. So when do we expect to see responses? And to me, I think there's kind of both a short-term response and within a season response versus a yearly type response.
Right, so the video question in terms of when will water levels come back up, there's a little bit of context there. As we talked about earlier, there's a seasonal cycle within the year that the Great Lakes follow, and Great Lakes are rising, the water levels are rising right now, particularly on Michigan and Huron. From a longer term perspective, it's important to recognize that, as John just noted, that the water levels, particularly on Michigan and Huron, have in fact been relatively stable for about the past 13 years or so. They dropped dramatically in the late 1990s, and by dramatically I mean about 3 feet over the course of a few years, and since then have been relatively stable. In terms of when will water levels come up another 2 feet or go back down another 2 feet, we really don't know. It depends a lot on being able to first be able to project precipitation and evaporation rates into the future, and right now that's something that's very hard to do anywhere on the planet.
All right, we have one question from the audience here.
Hi, Jim Newman from the Detroit Yacht Club. I know there's a lot of talk about contingency plans for continued long-term low water levels. Are there any in place if they dropped even further than they're at right now? Is there any plan currently in place for federal assistance or state assistance?
Jen, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of contingency plans or adaptive management that can impact lake levels into the future?
Well, yeah, so adaptive
management. You have
management
like 30
is,
seconds or a minute to cover it all,
okay.
Jen. Sorry.
The short version is, adaptive management is sort of a longer term strategy. So if lake levels were to drop dramatically next year, and we wouldn't necessarily have anything in place to address that. It would require more emergency measures like we've seen this summer with dredging from the state. But over the longer term, there's a number of things we can think about, and we should be thinking about those. New infrastructure that's adaptive, just addressing I think really it's an infrastructure question and making sure that your infrastructure goes up and down with lake levels.
But we can also then talk about regulating flows in and out of the Lake Superior and in Ontario as well a little bit.
Well, I mean, Lake Superior regulation is great for Lake Superior, but what we found in the study and what we've known for years, it has very little impact on Michigan Huron. Lake Ontario, they do a great job there for Lake Ontario, but again, that leaves Michigan Huron and Erie really natural, and learning to live with that is going to be key to the future.
All right, so we have about a minute left for kind of closing comments on lake levels and your thoughts, and anything else we should know. John?
I'll just say the Great Lakes are beautiful, complex, important systems. They sort of define a region. They're one of the greatest natural systems that are governed by 8 states and 2 provinces and 2 countries, and we do it collectively and collaboratively. Lake levels are a piece of that governance mechanism. And I think how we're best when we do this together. We're best when we come together and look at these systems as a system and that we plan accordingly. When we look at transportation as a system, when we look at the ecological health of the system as a system, we're best when we work together.
Well, great, John, and thanks to everybody on the panel. It was very enlightening, and it seems, again, that we need to be thinking not only short-term, but very long-term. We need to think about not just lake levels, but all the threats and all the impacts of the system, because they all tend to intersect and combine and operate together. But thank you very much, and we're going to head back to Christy in the booth.